Most people think a dictatorship starts with a tank crashing through a gate. It does not. It starts with a direct deposit hitting a bank account. We are taught that fascists took power by force, but the truth is much more uncomfortable. They bought it. They did not just march into history. They financed their way in. Fascism did not rise on fear alone. It rose on jobs and debt and a promise that the government would fix everything. When people think of fascism, they picture armies marching and flags waving. But beneath the theater, the real machinery was economic. Dictators did not just control the people with guns. They controlled them with payrolls. This is the story of how fascist leaders discovered that the easiest way to buy obedience was through employment. It is the story of how a generation desperate for security sold its freedom for a paycheck. The stage was set by disaster. In the 1920s, Europe was exhausted. The Great War had drained treasuries and destroyed industries. In Germany, hyperinflation turned savings into wallpaper. In Italy, returning soldiers found no jobs and no purpose. Democracies were young and broke. Then came the 1929 crash. Unemployment across Europe went above 30%. In the chaos, a new kind of politician emerged. They did not promise liberty. They promised order. Hitler and Mussolini did not rise because people wanted dictators. They rose because people wanted stability. Each man offered the same deal. Give up your political freedom in exchange for economic security. They understood that when money fails, ideology becomes currency. When Hitler took power in 1933, Germany had 6 million people unemployed, but within 3 years, unemployment had nearly vanished. To the world, it looked like a miracle. To the people, it felt like salvation. The Nazi regime was giving out jobs and building highways called They even promised a new affordable car called the Volkswagen. But behind the illusion was a secret. The Nazis did not find money. They invented it. They used secret promissory notes called Mefo. These were hidden credit notes disguised as industrial contracts. Instead of borrowing from banks, the state forced companies to accept these notes as payment. It was economic magic. It created full employment without visible debt. However, it was not productivity that fueled the recovery. It was war. Every new job was tied to the military. The highways were built for military transport. The factories making cars could switch to making tanks in weeks. The jobs miracle was just a rearmament program wrapped in national pride. The system worked because people did not feel oppressed. They felt employed. When your paycheck depends on the state, freedom becomes negotiable. In Italy, the leader known as the Duce promised unity. Mussolini offered a system called the corporate state. This was a system where workers and owners would supposedly cooperate for the national good. In practice, it was total control. The regime replaced free trade unions with groups run by the state. Wages and prices were fixed. Private companies only stayed private as long as they obeyed. Propaganda sold efficiency as a virtue. People said Mussolini made the trains run on time. It became a global cliché. But the numbers told another story. Productivity stayed flat and debt grew. Mussolini spent more than the country could afford on monuments and public works. To look successful, the regime lied about statistics and borrowed money from other countries. Italy was like a company faking profits for investors. In Spain, Francisco Franco tried a policy called This meant Spain would be totally self-sufficient and rely on no one. In practice, it was a disaster. Spain cut itself off from trade and rationed food. To get a job or a house, you needed loyalty instead of skill. Even when the economy failed, the loyalty stayed because people needed the state to survive. These regimes shared one formula: debt and jobs and propaganda. They created a society where dissent meant unemployment. Economic dependence became the weapon of the dictatorship. By the end of the 1930s, unemployment was gone and pride had returned. On the surface, fascism looked like a cure for chaos. But it was not a cure. It was a trade. The market was replaced by the iron fist of the state. Dictators learned that fear only holds power for a short time, but dependency can last forever. The worker who depends on the state does not revolt. He salutes for survival. The Nazi slogan said that work makes you free. They were twisting labor into loyalty. They used public works and military spending to give the illusion of wealth. But the money was not real. It was borrowed or printed or hidden. The Nazi economic miracle is often remembered as a success. It should not be. Unemployment went down, but wages stayed the same and prices rose. Workers lost their power to bargain. Real income fell, but propaganda told people they were richer. They were given cheap radios, and vacations run by the state. It was entertainment to keep them quiet. When war came, this machinery of obedience shifted into overdrive. Workers did not need to be convinced to make weapons. They were already conditioned to see production as a duty. That is how you build an army before the first battle is declared. You turn the entire economy into an assembly line of loyalty. Here is the uncomfortable part. The economics of control did not die in 1945. They evolved. Modern governments learned the same lesson. You can buy stability with jobs and credit. When unemployment rises, the solution is always the same: massive public spending and patriotic branding. The message is familiar. Work is dignity. Support the nation. You do not need a dictator for a system that trades freedom for comfort. Today, the relationship between governments and citizens often looks like a payroll. The same dependence is now built through debt and subsidies. When your mortgage depends on interest rates and your income depends on state industries, you have to ask how free you really are. You do not need censorship when compliance is profitable. All across the world, governments are using the old tools of economic control and new packaging. When growth stops, central banks print money to fund jobs. Citizens cheer because stability feels good. But just like the 1930s, it is often debt being recycled instead of wealth being created. Jobs become extensions of policy. Industries like defense and energy survive because they are politically useful. The lesson of fascism is not just about history. It is about human behavior. People do not fall for dictators because they love tyranny. They fall for the illusion of safety. When economies collapse, people will trade their voices for stability. Fascism did not sell an idea. It sold insurance, and the cost was freedom. The ultimate irony is that the security people traded their lives for was a lie. By 1939, the treasuries were empty. The only way to pay the debt of order was to invade other countries and steal their wealth. The final stage of fascist economics was not stability. It was expansion. When there was nothing left to borrow, the regimes borrowed lives. That is how economic control became global war. The warning is simple. When the promise of security becomes permanent policy, then freedom becomes temporary. Every empire that bought loyalty with jobs eventually paid for it with blood. Every democracy that forgets how fascism funded itself risks repeating those methods. Economic control does not always march in a uniform. Sometimes it arrives wearing a suit and promising growth. By the time you realize the cost, your freedom is already gone. The ultimate truth is that history is a cold accountant. It reminds us that any stability bought with borrowed freedom eventually goes bankrupt. If you want to see the future, stop watching the speeches. Start watching the ledgers